The rain outside Verdun sounds like gravel hitting canvas. Inside the stockade tent, the damp, cold smells of wet wool mud and 3 dozen men who have reached the absolute end of their endurance. It is October 1944, a 20-year-old soldier, Private Edward Cole of the 28th Infantry Division, sits on a wooden crate near the center post. He is a combat fatigue patient from Baltimore, jailed for wandering away from his unit near the mud-choked tracks outside Schmidt. In his right hand, his thumb traces the scratched casing of a tarnished copper pocket watch. Then the flap pulls back, three-star generals step into the gloom, flanked by the stockade commandant, General George S. Patton Jr.'s sweeping the rear facilities, his eyes hard beneath his helmet. The room freezes, guards go rigid. Men on cots try to pull themselves into something resembling military posture, their eyes wide with sudden panic, but Edward Cole does not flinch. He stands up from his crate. His knees tremble slightly, but he straightens his spine until he is as rigid as a rod. Before the general takes another step, Cole brings his right hand up to his forehead, holding a razor-sharp textbook salute. The air in the tent locks solid. Officers stop breathing. Nobody salutes a general inside a stockade tent while under lockup. What happened in the next 60 seconds would reveal the true nature of the commander everyone thought they knew. And the answer was not what anyone in that room was prepared for. If you want more untold stories from World War II, hit that subscribe button. Let me back up a second. Because to understand what it cost Private Edward Cole to raise his hand in that tent, you need to understand what this space was, and what the operational environment demanded. In October 1944, the stockade facility near Verdun was not just a collection of canvas enclosures holding disciplinary cases. It was the holding pen for the human wreckage of the European theater. The air smelled perpetually of wet canvas, heavy mud, unwashed wool, and cheap tobacco smoke. Rain streamed down the slanted roofs of the tents in relentless gray sheets, saturating the earth until the floors were slick trenches of clay. The men confined inside were not hardened criminals or saboteurs. Most were soldiers whose nerve had snapped under the unrelenting artillery strain of the Hürtgen forest or the mud-clogged approaches to the Siegfried Line. They lived under constant military authority, stripped of their weapons, their badges, and their dignity, watched over by armed stockade guards whose job was to maintain order through cold detachment. In a place like that, the unwritten rules of military hierarchy were simple and absolute. Prisoners did not address general officers unless spoken to. They certainly did not initiate formal military courtesies from inside a lockup tent. A private under disciplinary detention occupied the lowest rung of the entire Allied command structure, while a 3-star Army commander held absolute authority over life, death, and court-martial proceedings. When General Patton entered a room, protocol dictated that the facility commander gave the orders, the guards snapped to attention, and the prisoners remained silent and motionless. To break that protocol was to invite immediate discipline, a public dressing down, or an extended sentence. Every man in that tent knew the history of high-ranking inspections. They knew the risks of attracting personal attention from a commander famous for his unyielding standards of military appearance and discipline. Beyond the canvas walls of the stockade, the operational stakes for the Third Army were reaching a critical point. Supplies were tight, ammunition was rationed, and every combat division required maximum fighting strength to push toward the German border. The human arithmetic of the war was brutal and unyielding. Every soldier locked in a rear-area stockade represented a rifle missing from the front lines, a position left undermanned in the foxholes, and a replacement that had to be drawn from an already straining logistics pipe. A single soldier removed from combat forced another man to take double shifts on watch or hold a ridge line without relief. High Command viewed men in the stockade through the cold lens of lost manpower hours and degraded unit readiness, and that was the room. Private Edward Cole raised his hand in. Picture the scene. It was a cold Tuesday afternoon, and inside the canvas walls 36 men sat on narrow folding cots or upturned wooden ration crates, their feet resting in 2 inches of churned, freezing mire. The only light came from 2 flickering kerosene lamps hung from the main ridgepole, casting long wavering shadows across the wet canvas overhead. Captain Marcus Stone, the stockade commandant, stood near the entrance, his jaw tight, his hands clamped nervously behind his belt as he watched the general step through the mud-drenched flap. Beside Patton stood his aides, Men who had spent weeks watching their commander drive the Third Army across France with unyielding, relentless momentum. Every officer in that tent was running the exact same calculation. They knew the stories from Sicily. They knew how General Patton reacted to men who had buckled under the weight of the front line, men whose minds had simply given out under the relentless, crushing cadence of high explosive artillery. Captain Stone braced himself, fully expecting the general to launch into a blisteringly harsh reprimand about discipline, posture, and the complete degradation of military standards in a rear-area lockup. The stockade guards held their breath, their fingers rigid against the wood of their rifles, waiting for the sudden, furious outburst that usually accompanied an unexpected inspection of locked-up soldiers. Stay with me, because what happened next in that room is the part nobody was expecting. The accounts that survive from that wet afternoon in Verdun are consistent in shape. As Private Edward Cole brought his fingertips up to meet his brow, General Patton did not snap. He did not bark for the stockade guards. Not the way a general looks at a soldier who has broken lockup protocol, not the way a commanding officer looks at an insubordinate prisoner. He looked at Private Cole the way a commander looks at a man standing on an exposed ridge holding his ground against an oncoming tide. Before the young soldier could even complete the upward movement of his arm, Patton swept his right hand up to the brim of his helmet, rendering a crisp, deliberate, high-ranking salute back to the locked-up private first. The silence that followed was absolute. Captain Stone stood motionless, his breath catching in his throat. Patton lowered his hand slowly, his face completely devoid of fury. He turned his eyes toward the stockade commandant, gesturing toward the trembling private. He ordered Cole released from the stockade immediately, directing that he be transferred directly to a rear-area rest depot rather than returned to confinement or court-martial proceedings. Then, speaking with the brief razor-sharp clarity that marked his private interactions, Patton offered his verdict to the room. He said, "He is tired, not yellow." Captain Stone later described the general's exit with one single word: deliberate. Patton turned on his heel and walked back out into the freezing Verdun rain without addressing another man in the tent. Now here is the thing, see. What most folks don't realize is that Patton was not reversing his stance on discipline, or abandoning his famous intolerance for battlefield evasion. He was making a precise operational judgment based on military posture. Patton knew that a coward under lockup hides in the corner, avoids eye contact, and lets his shoulders collapse under the weight of disgrace. But Edward Cole had not hidden, despite the exhaustion racking his nervous system. Despite the terrifying arrival of a three-star Army commander, Cole had pulled his fractured strength together to offer the highest sign of respect known to the profession of arms. Patton saw that the private's military spirit was intact, even if his nervous system had buckled under heavy shellfire. Returning a man in that condition to a prison tent was an improper military calculation that wasted a capable soldier. Sending him to a rest depot preserved human material for the battles ahead. To Patton, that quick salute was not a breach of stockade rules. It was proof of an unbroken soul, every officer who served under General George S. Patton Jr. during the European campaign understood that the Third Army operated at a tempo unmatched by any other command. Decisions that would take days in rear echelon headquarters were executed in minutes along the forward line, driven by Patton's belief that speed, audacity, and relentless pressure were the ultimate life-saving tools on a battlefield. Yet this relentless drive was balanced by an unyielding respect for practical competence on the ground, proving time and again that a commander who listens to physical ground truth is a commander who achieves decisive victory. The historical records preserved from the Third Army's advance across Europe demonstrate a consistent pattern. Tactical momentum relied not merely on grand strategic maps, but on the quiet, unheralded competence of ordinary soldiers doing their duty under extreme pressure, whether in the freezing mud of the Ardennes or the dust of western France. Moments of unexpected courage and technical precision defined the true character of the Allied war effort. Military historians who study the European theater often note that leadership in combat requires a rare combination of absolute authority and quiet humility. To command hundreds of thousands of men across enemy territory demands unwavering resolve, but to recognize the truth when presented by a lower-ranking subordinate requires genuine greatness of character. Every officer who served under General George S. Patton Jr. during the European campaign understood that the Third Army operated at a tempo unmatched by any other command. Decisions that would take days in rear echelon headquarters were executed in minutes along the forward line, driven by Patton's belief that speed, audacity, and relentless pressure were the ultimate life-saving tools on a battlefield. Yet this relentless drive was balanced by an unyielding respect for practical competence on the ground, proving time and again that a commander who listens to physical ground truth is a commander who achieves decisive victory. Before the war ever reached Europe, Edward Cole grew up on East Baltimore Street, 2 blocks from the harbor docks where his father worked 12-hour shifts as a boiler mechanic. His father was a quiet man who spent his Sundays at a wooden workbench in the cellar, repairing mechanical clocks and pocket watches for neighbors who could not afford a jeweler. From the age of 10, Edward sat on a stool beside him, learning how to handle tiny balance wheels, delicate hairsprings, and brass gears with steady, deliberate hands. He learned that a watch did not care about force or anger. It only responded to alignment and patience. When Edward turned 18 in 1942, his father handed him a tarnished copper pocket watch with a worn balance wheel, telling him that as long as the gears turned, a man could keep his internal timing, no matter how loud the world got around him. Before he was drafted into the 28th Infantry Division, Edward worked as a precision machinist's apprentice at a gear-cutting shop near the Baltimore shipyards. He had a girl named Clara who worked at a local insurance office and sent him 2 letters a week written in neat, tight script. They planned to buy a small brick row house near Patterson Park after the war. Edward was not a hero. He was the kind of man who looked at a chaotic room and instinctively looked for the mechanism that kept it together. When Cole was informed the next morning that his court-martial charges were dropped and that he was being moved to a rear area rest facility, he did not cheer or celebrate. He picked up his canvas duffel bag, checked the copper watch in his pocket to make sure it was still ticking, and quietly asked the desk sergeant when the next transport truck was leaving. Captain Marcus Stone served through the rest of the European campaign, keeping his Stockade logbooks with meticulous care. Years after the war, living as a retired hardware store owner in Ohio, he kept a copy of the Third Army inspection roster framed on his study wall. He told his family that among all the high-ranking officers and historical figures he witnessed during the war, the quiet exchange in that damp Verdun tent was the only moment that showed him the true weight of military authority. Edward Cole survived the war, returned to Baltimore, and spent 34 years working as a master toolmaker. He kept the tarnished copper pocket watch on his nightstand until the day he died, its quiet ticking, a constant reminder of the moment a general recognized the machinery of his spirit. Was General Patton right to return the salute of a jailed private and order his immediate release to a rest depot? Some would say no. They would argue that strict military discipline requires uniform enforcement regardless of personal condition, and that showing leniency to a soldier in confinement compromises the absolute authority needed to maintain order across an entire army. Others would say exactly the opposite. They would argue that true military leadership relies on recognizing the precise boundary between a spirit that is broken and one that is merely exhausted, and that preserving an honorable soldier's dignity does far more for an army's combat strength than rigid adherence to protocol ever could. Let us know in the comments below. And if you want more untold stories from World War II, make sure you subscribe.